Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our comparison of World of Tanks and War Thunder. All vehicles in World of Tanks are broadly split across 5 different classes. You have light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery. Now you might assume with how regimented World of Tanks is with a lot of its aspects that these classes would be very well defined, in which case you would actually be kind of incorrect. It turns out there aren't any universal class features for any of these classes outside of specifically the artillery class. There are of course general rules, such as heavy tanks usually having good armor and good hit points, medium tanks usually being somewhat more versatile, and of course light tanks having good concealment and spotting. However, these are only general rules. If the designers simply choose to alter a vehicle's stats to where it is more in line with a vehicle of another class, then they can just do it at any time, and they have done it several times in the past. To use some basic examples, if you were to go to tier 10 and look at the Maus and compare it side by side with the AMX-50B, the Maus is a very heavily armored ball of hit points that can take an absolute punishment, whereas the AMX-50B is almost more like a fat medium tank that relies more on its mobility and burst damage and can't really take much of a beating. If you were to then pan over to the tier 10 tank destroyers, and you would see something like the T110E4, which is basically just another heavy tank, and side by side it with something like the Gorilla 15, which is really just a long range sniper with no meaningful armor to speak of, you start to see that a lot of these classes are really more guidelines than hard and fast rules. While light tanks are at least a lot more consistent at the higher echelons in the game and even the mid tiers, if you go low enough you will start to run into light tanks like the AMX-40 or the Valentine, which are very heavily armored but also very slow and can't really do the scouting role. Then again, at the lower echelons, the classes are even more of a guideline than normal. This also brings up a bit of an interesting point. If you go to the collectors section of some of the tech trees that have been in the game for a while, you'll notice there's a lot of very low rank vehicles there, and that's because very early on in the game's life cycle, once you got through the first tier 1 vehicle, it would immediately open up to a bunch of different branches, whereas now you go through usually tier 1 to 3 without really seeing any variation, and even tier 4 is pretty light. This leads to the first few tiers of the game being fairly homogeneous in terms of the types of vehicles you'll run against and even the specific models of vehicles you'll run against, although you can still get the collector's vehicles if you're high enough in the appropriate tech tree, but this does make the low tier matches feel fairly light in terms of overall variety. Of course, this does bring us around to the artillery class, which is a class we haven't really talked about that much up to this point in the game because it is fairly unique. How artillery works is that in artillery vehicles, you can't aim normally. Instead, you can either shoot from the third-person view or you can go into a top-down view. While in this top-down view, render distance is effectively removed for artillery pieces and you can see enemies anywhere they are on the map. Also, this is one of the few instances in which the range of a vehicle's weapon will actually come up, although in practice most maps are relatively small and the range on most artillery is long enough that you won't see it come up that often. Of note, artillery does tend to have a lot less hit points than contemporary vehicles of their tier, and combined with fairly poor performance characteristics and the inability to aim and a long reload, and they tend to be very reliant on their teammates scouting for them, and they can't really do a lot on their own. Now, artillery has 3 shell types, but they're somewhat different from the shell types on a normal vehicle. The first shell type has the largest blast radius and does modest damage, but it also inflicts a stunning effect that will reduce the enemy's characteristics for an amount of time based on the power of the shell and how close they are to the impact. The second type is a high explosive round that does more damage in a smaller radius, and the third type is an armor piercing round that has no blast radius but will do more damage still. Now, a long time ago, artillery shells used to do a ton of damage, but also had a fairly high amount of randomness both in their damage spread and their accuracy. While this meant it was unlikely for artillery to land a direct hit, if it did land a direct hit, it could basically destroy any vehicle in the game. The system wasn't that well liked by players because it felt very random. You basically had no control over it. Obviously, if you knew the artillery was targeting you, you could try to put solid objects between you and it, but if it was the very first shot the artillery fired and it landed directly and knocked you back to the hangar, there really wasn't any meaningful counterplay. The stun mechanic, along with a reduced damage range for the shells, was added to the game to theoretically try to make artillery more engaging and encourage artillery to hit clusters of enemies rather than harass one specific person. In practice, what this has really done is made artillery more of a source of harassment than a source of damage, which hasn't really satisfied both parties. On the receiving end, players aren't exactly any more happy getting stunned than they are taking a bunch of damage, and the artillery players themselves, having an only marginal impact on the battlefield, aren't exactly stoked about it either. Additionally, heavy tanks barely taking any damage means they can basically stay in the same spot over and over again. They don't rely a lot on the crew skills and the things that will be negatively affected by the stun to be effective, as they are reliant more on their hard stats like armor. and this means that artillery harassing the heavy tank line is almost a waste of time. It feels like Wargaming doesn't really know what to do with the artillery class, as they haven't added new artillery in a very long time, and even artillery premium vehicles are few and far between. And the selection of artillery basically hasn't changed at all since I left the game, which doesn't really bode well for that class. However, there are still some few standouts like the M53-55 for USA and the French Leffe premium artillery piece, but those are more of the exception rather than the rule. Now, World of Tanks does have a few subclasses, but these aren't commonly used for anything, except for one. The wheeled light vehicles for France actually have several special attributes that make them stand out, and not only that, actually make them kind of overpowered. For starters, they're actually incredibly fast compared to basically all contemporary light tanks, which doesn't exactly go well in concert with the fact that you do have to factor in accuracy RNG and even individual player ping. If you're on a fairly bad connection and you're trying to hit these things, it can feel like a complete lottery. Of course, for most light tanks, you can counter them by simply hitting the tracks. This will completely immobilize them and make them an easy target because it'll take them a while to accelerate back up to speed. However, hitting a wheel on a wheeled light tank only slows it down, and the wheel will actually begin repairing while the vehicle is still moving for some reason. So these vehicles can often take a hit to the wheel and not really be all that bothered by it, on top of the fact that you have to hit multiple wheels to actually fully immobilize the vehicle, and they can simply use a repair kit if they don't want to suffer the speed loss. The tier 8 and higher wheeled light tanks also have a rapid mode. This rapid mode allows them to switch between either being more agile or faster depending on what they need for a given situation. And of course, World of Tanks vehicles moving like they're on rails means it's fairly easy for even a relatively inexperienced driver to maintain speed, especially on some of the larger and more open maps. The developers also reasoned that it would be somewhat difficult to use auto aim, so they actually gave them a much more generous auto aim bubble than most other vehicles, and for some reason they also gave quite a few of them fairly high penetration, high explosive shells, so they're actually pretty good at taking out other light tanks. Now, the developer intent was that the view range of these vehicles being relatively low for a vehicle of their battle rating would limit what they could do realistically. However, what they failed to account for was that at this point, World of Tanks has so many different modifiers that you can add to increase view range and camouflage that they were able to do the job of a normal light tank perfectly fine if you're willing to invest the resources into it, but also had the other benefits of being a wheeled light tank at the same time. The developer's solution to this was fairly straightforward. While they did institute some nerfs, ultimately the real solution was to add a rule into the matchmaker wherein a wheeled light tank must be countered by a wheeled light tank on the enemy team. This officially makes wheeled light tanks the only subclass of vehicles in the entire game to have their own matchmaking rules. That makes a nice segue into World of Tanks matchmaking. Now, in World of Tanks, vehicles are separated across 10 tiers and the 5 vehicle types, and the matchmaker will generally try to make sure every vehicle of a specific tier and type is countered by another vehicle of the same tier and type on the enemy team. We've already seen one of the core flaws in this balancing philosophy because, well, obviously you can have a pretty big disparity between the stats of different vehicles even of the same type and tier. However, there are some other problems with the World of Tanks matchmaker. When you queue up for a match, you queue up with a specific vehicle, and then the game assigns you the map later, so if the map is not suitable for your vehicle at all, you just kind of get to have a really bad game and there's nothing you can do about it. Queuing up with artillery only to find yourself on Himmelsdorf is a pretty sad experience, but queuing up with a very slow heavy tank on a map like Prokhorovka or Malinovka isn't significantly better. The game also uses a system called +2-2 matchmaking, in which you can see vehicles 2 tiers above or 2 tiers below you in your match. So if you queued with a tier 7, the spread of tiers you could see in your match would be tier 5 to tier 7, tier 6 to tier 8, or tier 7 to tier 9. The stat disparity between a vehicle and another vehicle that is 2 tiers higher than it can be fairly pronounced. The amount of penetration you can expect even on standard shells is pretty different, as is the amount of armor, but it's also noteworthy that the amount of hit points and damage also increase as you go up as well. And this means a lot of scenarios where the enemy can just straight up take you out 50% faster than you can take them out, in which case you have to really play that situation incredibly well to come out on top, and you'll lose most of the time. World of Tanks does have various matchmaking schemes like 3-5-7, wherein you have 3 top tier, 5 mid tier, and 7 bottom tier tanks. However, these are only loose suggestions, and the game will generally try to make a match with whatever it can if it can't find that specific schema available. One of the theoretical benefits of the World of Tanks system is that because the game knows what vehicle you're in when you go into the matchmaking process, it could theoretically match you better. However, because it only looks at the tier and type of vehicle, and as we've discussed, you can have a lot of variance between different types, you can end up with some very asymmetric matches, especially if you have maps that heavily favor one type of tank over another. Vehicle classes in War Thunder are usually marked by what vehicles do or don't have. In the case of heavy tanks, they don't really have any extra features, they just have a higher spawn cost, with the assumption being that their ability to bounce shells and their powerful guns are probably going to do a lot of work in terms of getting them extra score and spawn points. Self-propelled guns, or tank destroyers as they're more commonly called, also don't have any special abilities but do have a much lower spawn cost than most other vehicles, meaning you can often take them out even if you're getting fairly low on spawn points, which makes them a good choice for any lineup. Medium tanks have a moderate spawn cost and have access to the artillery modification. What artillery does is, if you have researched it, you can call an artillery on part of the battlefield. There will be 3 spotter rounds using orange smoke to bracket the area, and then a barrage will take place on that area. While artillery is a pretty big threat to lightly armored vehicles, it has to land a pretty good hit against heavily armored vehicles to take them out, but it is certainly possible. And of course, sometimes artillery does dumb things like take out planes. It is still a projectile after all, and thus can theoretically hit anything. How frequently you can call in artillery and how accurate it is will depend on the crew skills of your vehicle. Now, for moment-to-moment gameplay, the rank of a vehicle in War Thunder usually doesn't mean anything, it's almost exclusively used for researching. However, specifically for light tanks and the light tank master race, it is used to determine what superpowers they unlock. At rank 2, light tanks unlock the ability to scout enemies, at rank 6 they unlock the ability to use a drone to scout enemies, and at rank 7 they unlock the ability to use thermal imaging on their drone to scout enemies. They also have access to artillery strikes and frequently have access to other abilities as well. On top of that, light tanks also have access to the airstrike modification, so when they scout enemies, this will actually reduce the spawn cost of any planes they want to spawn. And of course, this brings us to the anti-air class. Anti-airs generally have fast-firing autocannons, they have one of the lowest spawn costs in the game, and they also have access to artillery strikes so they can try to affect the battlefield that way. Some of the higher tier missile-based anti-air that can't really hurt ground vehicles all that well do get access to scouting so they can do something if there are no planes in the air. While there are of course always vehicles that break the mold, on the whole War Thunder vehicles do generally abide by these rules more often than they don't. This of course brings us to a widely debated part of War Thunder, and that is how aircraft work. While planes do have a spawn cost and you spawn them like you do any ground vehicle, their spawn cost is typically high enough that you can't spawn them at the beginning of a match. Additionally, unlike other ground vehicles where their spawn cost is generally fixed, the spawn cost of an aircraft will vary based on how much ordnance you take out and what types of ordnance you take out. So a clean wing fighter is going to cost noticeably less to spawn than a fully equipped ground attacker. Now obviously the anti-air class is meant to counter the air to an extent, however at most battle ratings these simply represent a soft counter rather than a hard counter. It doesn't completely remove the viability of aircraft, especially if the aircraft is particularly good at flying and you are not particularly good at shooting at it. Air and anti-air obviously have some of the biggest technology leaps as you go from low tiers to high tiers. At the low tiers you're shooting autocannons and heavy machine guns at planes that are simply firing normal rockets and bombs, whereas at high tiers you have various guided missiles, laser guided bombs, optically guided missiles and bombs being thrown at each other. In this respect, understanding the technical limitations of the munitions of both sides is actually just as important, if not more so, than accurately landing your shots, as a lot of the munitions will generally hit targets pretty easily. This is also where the more esoteric parts of War Thunder come in, because there's a big difference between an anti-aircraft shooting an infrared missile or a radar guided missile at you, and there's also a big difference between an aircraft dropping a laser guided bomb or firing an optically guided missile at your anti-aircraft, and you do kind of need to know this if you're going to be successful in shooting down planes or delivering ordnance to target. The reason why aircraft aren't universally liked is, well, a lot of ground vehicles simply don't have a meaningful way to counter them effectively, especially when you're talking ground vehicles that don't have any kind of roof-mounted machine gun. It can often feel like you're simply at the mercy of the pilot, and whether or not that pilot lands its shot has very little to do with your actions and everything to do with their skill. Additionally, you have what's referred to as revenge casts, where you take somebody out and they have enough spawn points to spawn an aircraft and they come out looking specifically for you, and in that case there's often not much you can do about it. In this respect, I would actually liken Air in War Thunder to old school artillery in World of Tanks, in that it often feels very random as to exactly when you get targeted, as the enemy might go after you because you're in a strategic position, you're doing something useful, or you're taking a point, or they might just target you because you're the first thing they saw, and you really don't have any way to control this. However, much like artillery in World of Tanks, air often isn't that powerful, at least for its spawn points. Sure, a plane with two 1,000-pound bombs can seem like there's nothing you can do about it, but the spawn cost they paid for it and the amount of time it takes for them to rearm is actually fairly considerable, and they could easily have done just as much if not more damage in a ground vehicle. The major advantage of planes is that you can be anywhere on the battlefield fairly quickly delivering your ordnance, and this works incredibly well if you're in a squadron and one of your teammates requests help, and it always feels very satisfying to land that perfectly placed bomb to save your teammate from certain demise. That being said, while you can generally convince most War Thunder players to begrudgingly accept the existence of planes in the game, it's a lot less common to find players that will adamantly defend helicopters. Helicopters have a lower spawn cost, they have a lower repair cost, they can spawn with a lot more guided missiles, and they can also use terrain to their advantage and stay on station harassing you endlessly until they take you out. If a plane misses you with a bomb or a missile, they have to reset for an entire attack pass to attempt again, and they only have so many of them. If something like an Apache or a Ka-50 misses you with one of their missiles, they still have at least 10 more ready to go, and they can just stay there and fire the next one as soon as the first one misses. There's also the problem that helicopters can be spawned at the beginning of the match. When you do this, you can only take things like gun pods and rockets, and of course they are an easier target than a plane, but the helicopter rushes still represent a fairly annoying aspect of War Thunder, as your entire team now has to focus fire these helicopters down, since helicopter damage models are still at best very wonky and often don't take damage like they should. For better or worse, close air support is just an intrinsic part of War Thunder, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. This does, however, bring up an interesting point, because it turns out in War Thunder and World of Tanks there is no friendly fire, with one very notable exception. For all types of aircraft, both planes and helicopters, friendly fire is in fact enabled, and you can shoot down friendly planes, and friendly planes can destroy you with their own bombs. There is a mechanic in which you can forgive teammates for destroying you, and there is also a mechanic wherein if you kill too many teammates, you will automatically get kicked from the match. This is especially common on aircraft with absolutely massive bombs like the British Lancaster with its 12,000 pounder, in which you will sometimes see a teammate drop a bomb, take out half of your own team, and then also immediately get kicked from the match. Of note, if you are destroyed by a teammate, you won't have to pay the repair bill, so there is at least that aspect of it. It is important to keep in mind that not all vehicles are symmetrically applied across all battle ratings. Heavy tanks don't appear at very low battle ratings, and they also tend to disappear around battle rating 7.7, despite the top tier being all the way up at 11.7. The highest battle rating heavy tank in a main tech tree is the Soviet T-10M, and the highest battle rating heavy tank overall is the event vehicle, the Object 279 at 9.0, and above this there are no heavy tanks in the game. Tank destroyers also tend to thin out fairly considerably around the 9.7 to 10 OBR, so at the absolute highest tier of the game, it is a lot of main battle tanks, aka medium tanks, fighting it out, with some light tanks and anti-air supporting. The matchmaker in War Thunder works very differently than it does in World of Tanks. When you queue up for a match in War Thunder, you automatically take all of the vehicles that you currently have queued for the selected nation into the match with you, and it will pair you based on the battle rating of the highest BR vehicle you currently have. So if you have a BR 5.7 vehicle and a BR 6.7 vehicle in the same lineup, you will get BR 6.7 matchmaking. War Thunder uses a plus or minus 1 BR system, that is to say 6.7 could get paired up as high as 7.7 or as low as 5.7. Each BR jump in War Thunder has effectively 2 sub-BR jumps, so if you had a 5.0 to 6 point match, you could have 5.0, 5.3, 5.7, or 6.0 vehicles. Of note, unlike the +-2 matchmaking in World of Tanks, because vehicles can be knocked out with a single well-placed hit in War Thunder, it doesn't tend to be as punishing to get a max up tier in War Thunder as it is in World of Tanks. War Thunder also has a general matchmaking rule wherein no more than about a third of any given lobby can be at the highest possible battle rating, so a 5.7 vehicle will never fight an entire lobby of 6.7 vehicles. However, one major difference is that War Thunder pairs you based on the nation you're in, and unless it's really having some trouble with the matchmaker, will generally try to keep one nation to one team, so you'll have, for example, Germany and Russia fighting USA, France, Britain, etc. The problem with this national matchmaking is not every country has access to the same types of vehicles at the same battle rating, so you can end up in scenarios where the combination of countries you or the opposing team get has obvious gaps and there's not really much you can do about it. All that being said, the War Thunder matchmaker does have one noticeable advantage, and that is you get to see the map and battle rating spread that you're playing at before you decide which specific vehicles you want to spawn, so you can select vehicles that are appropriate to the map and battle rating range, and you don't necessarily have to play a vehicle that will just be completely useless on that map. This does encourage the player to have a decent variety of vehicles available so they can cover a wide variety of different situations and battle rating ranges for their lineup. And that wraps up the comparison for today. Please stay tuned for the next installment in the series, and obviously if you want to make sure you don't miss it, please hit that subscribe button. We still have to go over the maps, the researching, and the economy, and the free-to-play aspects. Hope to see you next time. As always, don't commit to shoes.